Many people do think of the war as a European war, or maybe they think the United States and Canada were also involved. But this was a true world war, with soldiers from every continent except Antarctica. And one place that sent more than 1 million men to the war was India. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode about India and the First World War. In 1914, India had not been involved in any large-scale conflicts outside of its immediate area for a long time. There had been wars in its own neighborhood, though. The First and Second Afghan Wars and the 3 Burmese Wars saw the participation of the Indian Army. Indian forces had also been in colonial expeditions in Africa and a small contingent in Europe during the Russo-Turkish War, but only really the sepoys, Indian soldiers under British command. The bulk of India's population, which the ruling British Raj thought unfit for military service, remained largely unaffected. The First World War, though, affected the Indian population directly or indirectly like no event since the First Indian War for Independence in 1857 had done. India was such a large reservoir of human and material resources that the British Empire, faced with shortages of both, had no choice but to tap that reservoir, regardless of their own reservations regarding its worth. There were plenty of people in India who were against imperial rule. The Swadeshi self-sufficiency movement was an economic strategy aimed at removing Britain from power and improving India's economy. It boycotted British products and revived domestic products and production, and had some success. The second Swadeshi movement from 1905 to 1911 was the most successful pre-Gandhi movement, and Swadeshi as a strategy was a key focus of Gandhi's, who described it as the soul of self-rule. The war fanned a flame of anti-colonial nationalism around the world, and there were many who believed that the inter-European conflict exploded the myth of the superiority of Western civilization by exposing its dark underside of violence and barbarity. That theme had been developing in India for a couple of decades by the war's beginning, and found expression particularly in the writings of Mohandas Gandhi during his time as a lawyer in South Africa. He argued against India's choosing a path of violence against British domination, arguing that by doing that, they would be just mimicking the West and could not attain true self-rule. The exposures to the horrors of industrialized warfare in World War I added some persuasion to his argument. There were anti-British revolutionaries who tried to take advantage of the war to fight British rule. There was Jatin Mukherjee in India, or the Berlin Committee in Germany, which was a propaganda agency supported by German intelligence that was directed at Indian soldiers who had been taken prisoner of war. And the Gadre Revolution Party in California, which revolved around a newspaper for the small but rapidly growing Sikh diaspora, are examples. But by 1917, it was clear these were failures. But also by then, the war had become increasingly unpopular in India, at first by economics, and then by the losses of men to the war, particularly in Punjab province, where a large part of the men fighting came from. Some of the pre-1914 extreme nationalists took advantage of this to make a political comeback. There were Home Rule Leagues, loosely knit organizations inspired by the Irish, and though they did not directly oppose the war, they tried to use it to push an agenda of self-rule. Gandhi, who returned to India in 1915, actually called on Indians to enlist in the army, despite his own belief in nonviolence, in the hope that such loyalty would be rewarded post-war with large political concessions. A declaration in 1917 by British Secretary of State for India Samuel Montagu made vague promises of a measure of self-government, but signaled no major change in British policy. Gandhi's disappointment over this led him to openly oppose the Raj in 1919, with his first attempt to apply to India the lessons learned in South Africa about nonviolent resistance, which made him a household name in India, but which is outside the scope of this channel. But the mindset of a chunk of the middle class loyal before the war appeared to have been changed by the war. The All India Home Rule League was founded in 1916 to lead the demand for self-government and obtain the same dominion status in the empire as Australia or Canada. The national headquarters was in Delhi, though the main activity was in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. This movement created considerable excitement, and particularly under the leadership of Annie Besant, managed to produce a remarkable alliance of moderates and radicals, as well as the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League. After Besant was arrested in 1917, the movement spread to the interior villages. The war had put an end to a period of relative economic prosperity, though that prosperity had never reached the mass population. It rested on the export of cash crops like cotton and tea. Coal mining and steel were also on the rise, but the massive requisitioning of things like cereals for the 1.5 million Indians who served in the war led to a rapid rise in food prices that hurt the urban poor and agricultural laborers. Exports of cash crops suffered from the loss of the German market and the threat of submarines. The steel mills were saved from bankruptcy, though, by a contract to supply rails for the 1,500 miles of railway the British built in Mesopotamia during the war. The main beneficiary of the war was the domestic manufacturing industry, but the bulk of the people saw a decline in an already low purchasing power, and the role played by India in the imperial economy diminished. This was partly also from the demographic disaster of the Spanish flu, that in the space of a year resulted in something up to 20 million deaths in India, which was as much as a third of the global deaths from the flu pandemic. Over 60,000 Indians died in the war, and a slightly larger number than that were wounded. These numbers are low compared to the European nations fighting, but the departure of so many soldiers and laborers in total had a serious effect on rural and tribal areas. The soldiers themselves fought on the Western Front, Gallipoli, the Middle East, in Africa, and even at the siege of Qingdao. The Indian Expeditionary Force arrived in France just 6 weeks after the war broke out and fought at places like Ypres and Neuve-Chapelle. But they were hurt by a lack of familiarity with the new equipment, having been trained more for colonial war. They had nearly no artillery, and they were not used to European weather and resisting the cold, so morale did suffer. Except for the cavalry divisions, they were sent to Egypt in late 1915 to fight in conditions to which they were better suited. Still, 130,000 Indians fought on the Western Front, all told. The largest force of Indians served in Mesopotamia from November 1914 to the end. They fought up the Tigris. They were a large part of the fort that surrendered at Kut. And then in 1917, they took Baghdad, and the following year fought the Battle of Sharqat, which resulted in the Armistice of Mudros. The Mesopotamian army was largely composed of Indian troops. Now, we'll see those battles in depth in the regular episodes. The First World War certainly exposed India to global currents. In 4 years, more Indians left India for faraway lands than in the preceding 100 years. Most of those men returned, bringing new ideas, products, and customs. At home, the war gave a big boost to the rise of Indian nationalism and the rejection of Western violence as a means to that end. Of course, there is a lot more to it, and you're encouraged to look it up for yourself. Today was just a general introduction to India before and during the war, where Indian soldiers did, time and again, prove themselves as the capable soldiers that their own government did not much believe in just 4 years earlier. Thanks to Pratik Gokhale for the research for this episode. If there is something that you know a lot about that you'd like to see us cover, please get in touch with Flo, our social media manager, and always check us out on Facebook. See you next time.